Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to show you results of our laboratory study of influence of rock fracture, rock fabric on hydraulic fracture propagation in laboratory research. It is well known that the most of unconventional reservoirs are highly heterogeneous and fractured, and their heterogeneity very often leads to high degree of geometrical complexity of created hydraulic fracture, resulting in some cases to low fracture conductivity, restricted proppant delivery, and low production, as was mentioned in the previous talk by Mark Zobak. And we performed a series of laboratory tests to investigate the influence of rock fabric on hydraulic fracture propagation, hydraulic fracture initiation, propagation, and the near wellbore complexity. In the frame of our long-term project, we varied different parameters like fluid viscosity, injection rate, completion geometry. We changed the size and orientation of wellbores and also perforations. And we performed long-term research in this direction. Today I have a chance only to show you results of influence of rock fabric on fracture containment, on near wellbore complexity, and also on the aperture of hydrofracture opening, significantly influencing proppant transport. At the beginning of my talk, as a reference, I'm going to demonstrate you results obtained during hydraulic fracturing of intact homogeneous sandstone samples. In the middle of the slide, you can see the photo of coltan sandstone samples, hydraulically fractured by fluid injection, and dark red color of the fluid on the photo demonstrate pure symmetrical pancake shape of created hydraulic fracture. I can tell you that in all our shale samples, the fracture shape is significantly more complicated than in case of homogeneous rock. And on the right side of the slide, you can see the photo of shale surface before the test, wiped with odorless mineral spirits that evaporates very fast from smooth surface, highlighting the structure of pre-existing cracks, bedding planes. And we investigated in our research the influence of this complicated rock fabric on the properties of created hydraulic fracture. Our acoustic emission sensors were embedded into the rock or embedded into the loading plates, and we used them for registration of both acoustic emission and also for periodic ultrasonic transmission measurements to calculate ultrasonic velocity that we took into account for our automatic calculations of hypercenters. Samples were loaded in polyaxial frames made by TerraTek, and the size of the frames is approximately 1 foot in the left side and 1 meter on the right side. And I will show you an example of both tests. And next slide shows acoustic emission signals presented as the spheres on the right animation plot. The diameter of the spheres proportional to the magnitude of events, the same as in seismology, and the color corresponds to the rainbow color bar presented in the bottom of the slide. And you can see that hydraulic fracture was initiated near the wellbore and then propagated with a symmetrical pancake with the good correspondence with the light red surface mapped by goniometer technique after the test and presented at the same slide. And as I mentioned, this pure symmetrical pancake shape was observed only in case of sandstone samples. I would like to mention that in case of high viscosity fluid injection, we observed initiation of hydraulic fracture significantly earlier than breakdown. This moment corresponds to very close to the volumetric measurements. This green curve is representing the volume of the rock measured in the direction of minimal horizontal stress, and red curve is the pressure, wellbore pressure. And in case of shale samples, two examples demonstrated in the next slide. On the upper part of the slide, results obtained with the high viscosity fluid injection, and in the lower part with the water injection. The photos of the surface of the blocks before test shown in the left part, and demonstrating the complicated rock fabric of the shale. And in the middle part of the slide, you can see the sketch of this pre-existing fractures mapped based on the photos of the sample. And on the right side, you can see the snapshot of acoustic emission signals at the moment of hydraulic fracture approach the surfaces. I would like to mention two common features of this slide. As I mentioned, that the shape of hydraulic fracture significantly differ from pure pancake shape. And also you can see that both tests demonstrates acoustic emission signals on the low part of the sample, very close to the place where we observed the smallest density of pre-existing fractures. And we interpret the results of this test that the hydraulic fracture propagation in the upper part of the sample was contained by this high density of highly illuminated pre-existing fractures in the upper part of the sample. The next slide demonstrates dynamic of acoustic emission. Registered in both cases, high viscosity fluid in the left side and low viscosity fluid in the right side. Results of our detailed analysis of this hydraulic fracturing were presented in our ARMA paper. And I would like to mention just a few features that viscosity plays very important role on the dynamic of hydraulic fracture propagation. You can see that in case of high viscosity fluid injection, we observed biwind fracture, but in case of water injection, we observed only single wind. When we measured the deformation of the block, it appears that in case of high viscosity fluid injection, volumetric deformation of the block was 10 times higher than in case of water injection. And also acoustic emission allow us to measure the dynamic of hydraulic fracture propagation, and the speed of acoustic emission cloud propagation was approximately 1,000 times faster in case of water injection than in case of high viscosity fluid injection. I would like to mention that injection rate was exactly the same in both cases. And our results are in good correspondence with the model proposed by Mark Zobak a couple decades ago, and predicting the stable fracture propagation in case of high viscosity fluid injection, where fluid has no chance to penetrate very fast to the fracture, and unstable fracture propagation in case of water injection, when fluid immediately penetrates into the fracture. When we investigated shale with the horizontal complexion, next slide shows the images obtained before a test and after the test. In this case, test, we use the epoxy as a fracturing fluid in order to map exact position of hydraulic fracture under the stress. We cured epoxy under the stress, and then only after that we unloaded sample. And you can see the structure of the rock wiped with odorless spirits, the same as before the test on the upper part. And on the lower part, I demonstrated the zoom of exactly the same place, but after the fracturing. And probably you can see this tiny hair-lined hydraulic fracture propagating and crossing bedding planes. And also this particular bedding planes was crossed by hydraulic fracture. After the test, we open this bedding plane, as demonstrated in the upper, in the low right photo of the slide, and we have found that epoxy spread along bedding plane, orthogonally to the direction of propagation of hydraulic fracture. And I would like to repeat once more that this was epoxy, and epoxy was cured under the stress. It means that we have evidence spreading of epoxy in the bedding planes under the stress. And you can see that it was a non-symmetrical shape of epoxy spreading along bedding plane, but clearly we have evidence that it's happened. The next slide shows the dynamic of acoustic emission of hydraulic fracture propagation in this case. And you can see that light red color of the surfaces mapped on the animation plot shows these two surfaces, hydraulic fracture and orthogonal spreading of epoxy along bedding plane. You can see that we observed, in this case, we also observed non-symmetrical shape of hydraulic fracture propagating mostly to one face of the rock, and also crossing the bedding plane. And you can see a pretty good correlation between position of our acoustic emission events with the actual position of the hydraulic fracture. But also you can see that we observed almost no acoustic emission events associated with the spreading of epoxy along bedding plane. And we explain this by assumption that this bedding plane was weak, and during spreading of epoxy, acoustic emission signals were below, generated very weak signals below threshold level. But you can see that we observed wider spreading of epoxy along bedding plane at the face where hydraulic fracture approached the surface with non-symmetric propagation, and we assume that it's related to the width or aperture of hydraulic fracture opening. At the very last part of my presentation, I would like to show you results of large block Niobrara shale samples. The size of the block was about 1 meter. And on the upper part of the plot, I demonstrated three orthogonal projections of acoustic emission events. In this case, wellbore was misaligned with the direction of principal stresses. We deliberately drilled wellbore in the 40-degree misalignment, but the slots, perforation slots, were aligned with the intermediate stress. And you can see that on the low part of the slide, I demonstrate density of acoustic emission events calculated within sliding cube of 1 inch side. And you can see that in this case, we also observed one wing fracture propagation, non-symmetrical, only propagating in one direction. In the middle part of the slide, I demonstrated different parameters registered during the test, and I would like to draw your attention to this red curve with the area highlighting the interval of analysis. And the red curve is the wellbore pressure, and also light blue curve is the flow to the fracture. In this test, we observed some abnormal behavior of wellbore pressure, that it was a small breakdown, small kink of the wellbore pressure that I call breakdown number 1. And then after that, wellbore pressure continued rising. And acoustic emission allow us to explain this behavior of wellbore pressure. You can see that close to the moment of first breakdown, acoustic emission cloud approached one face of the block, but then flow to the fracture was significantly lower than our injection rate. And therefore, wellbore pressure continued rising up to the second breakdown. And next slide shows 3D rendering of acoustic emission events and fracture surface marked at the red curve, and also green surface demonstrate you the pre-existing mineralized interface filled with calcite. You can see that acoustic emission events shows initiation of hydraulic fracture close to the wellbore, and then propagation parallel to the bedding planes demonstrated by blue color surfaces, and then propagation of acoustic emission in opposite direction was arrested by the presence of this mineralized interface, and therefore in this case we observed only one wing fracture. In this test, after the test, we cut large block, 1 meter size block on smaller cubes, 8 by 8 inches cubes, and you can see the photos of cubes, and then we dismantle all fracture and investigated in all details surface of hydraulic fracture and surface of this pre-existing interface. Especially on this middle part of the slide, you can see wellbore. In this case, we had a 3.5-inch wellbore with the two slots, perforation slots, aligned with the stress direction, and this part of the sample shows a mineralized interface. And the fracture was arrested by this interface. In order to measure aperture of hydraulic fracture opening, we mixed the fluid with the colored beads different color correspond to the different size. And we use these plastic bits as the gauges. The presence of these bits indicate that hydraulic fracture was more than diameter of the bits. And the photo on the left side shows bits distribution close to the perforation. And from analysis of 18 spots surrounding hydraulic fracture, we analyzed what was the aperture of hydraulic fracture under the stress. And this slide shows the summary of bits, colored bits distribution in the vicinity of northern slot and southern slot. I would like to remind you that northern slot was the direction where hydraulic fracture propagated as one wing fracture. And we have clear evidence that near the southern slot, close to the mineralized interface, we observed no particles at all. It means that we created some hydraulic fracture propagating a few inches from the slot, but it was no opening, because we have evidences that opening in the opposite direction was significantly higher than in direction where we have a mineralized interface. And therefore, we assume that this mineralized interface arrested fracture propagation and restricted fracture opening in other direction. And I would like to mention our conclusions that rock fabric plays an important role in hydraulic fracturing of shale. The presence of planes of weakness, such as mineralized natural fractures, can result in arrest of hydraulic fracture propagation. It can also result in poor fracture geometry with limited fracture aperture, leading to low fracture conductivity. And as we have evidence, it leads to high net pressure and restricted proppant delivery. And for successful stimulation of shales in the field condition, the rock fabric definitely should be taken into account. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sergey. We have time for some questions. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, we performed many tests with the proppants, and we definitely high viscosity fluid allow us to create wider opening of hydraulic fracture. And with the high viscosity fluid, we were able to deliver proppants to the hydraulic fracture. And very often, if I would like, I can mention the values, for example, of opening high viscosity fluid can give us opening 800 microns. And in case of water injection, we had only less than 100 microns opening. And it means that high viscosity fluid allow us to deliver proppants, and also it's increase our chances to cross interfaces. And we have a higher chances of crossing interfaces with the high viscosity fluid and successful proppant delivery. And in case of water injections, very often the water became turning, like I demonstrated in case of epoxy test, parallel to the pre-existing bending planes, and produce no proppant delivery.
So we have time for one more question. Sergey, did you see any fractures that weren't in the plane of your biplanar wings, or ways of reaching out into the rock fabric other than perpendicular to the well?
Yes, actually, acoustic emission events, as you saw on my animations, sometimes acoustic emission events were registered outside of the planes of created hydraulic fracture, and we call these events related to the rock compliance. That definitely we have a stressed rock, and therefore very often this stressed rock radiate some events related directly to the stress condition, not only to the fluid presence condition. But the most of events that were generated by injection, they were aligned within something like a half-inch accuracy from the plane mapped after the test by goniometer technique.